Disturb us, Adonai. Ruffle us from our complacency. Make us dissatisfied. Dissatisfied with the peace of ignorance, the quietude which arises from a shunning of the horror, the defeat, the bitterness and the poverty, physical and spiritual, of humans. Shock us, Adonai. Deny to us the false Shabbat which gives us the delusions of satisfaction amid a world of war and hatred. Wake us, O God, and shake us from the sweet and sad poignancies rendered by half-forgotten melodies and rubric prayers of yesteryears. Make us know that the border of the sanctuary is not the border of living, and the walls of your temples are not shelters from the winds of truth, justice, and reality. Disturb us, O Lord, and vex us. Let not your Shabbat be a day of torpor and slumber. Let it be a time to be stirred and spurred to action.
Welcome to Niche Retelling, the podcast where we explore all the ways old tales are made new. I am your host, Jasmine Garcia, and joining me today are...
I'm crawling out of the walls as Sam Marchioni. My hair is red because I dyed it with the first plague, blood.
My name is Callie, and I am a storm of lightning and hail, one of the other plagues.
I can't believe we're doing this.
It's Ilana Greenburg-Sud, and I am the plague of frogs, or possibly frog, but that's a translation quibble.
Hey, I'm Bex Silberfein. I am boils because my skin never quite grew out of puberty.
Hello everyone, my name is Leif Bradshaw, and I'm trying to improve my health by being less of a glutton because I am the locusts.
Dang. Everyone, welcome Leif, and don't shame yourself like that, my friend. I don't know what plague I am. I decided to opt out of that. But if you didn't guess, yeah, this is what we're doing for the Passover episodes, folks.
Maybe that intro could have used some workshopping. That one's on me, fans of the pod.
Thus saith the Lord.
That's right, folks. We're covering the Prince of Egypt, baby! As you can probably tell from that intro, we are all very excited. But before we go into just how awesome this movie is, well, I would say what's everyone's connection to the Exodus story, but considering the fact most of us are not Jewish...
Guess what? We're back again! In each retelling's favorite two Jews, here to help on every Jewish holiday.
I promise we're not trying to tokenize them, gang.
This might just
better.
be my branch of Episcopalianism, but the Exodus story was a pretty hefty part of my childhood too. Although that might partially be because I was raised on VeggieTales for a fraction of my lifetime.
Yes.
So I did have to hear about Joshua and the walls of Jericho extensively, and you can't really understand Joshua and the walls of Jericho without having the previous context of the Exodus story. And also, there was always the Ten Commandments playing on Turner Classic Movies on Easter weekend. And I've never made it through the Ten Commandments because it's a long fucking movie. But
what is it, like 3 hours? 4 hours?
I think it's
Something like that.
Something
like that.
And when you cut it up to include commercials, it's even fucking longer.
It'd be probably 4 hours at least with commercial breaks.
Yeah, and you're like,
commitment.
Cecil, wrap it up.
And this is much better.
I guess for me, my relation to the story of Passover is, well, I'm a Jew. I've been celebrating Passover for as long as I can remember. Though confusingly, now that you mentioned it, Sam, I do remember one specific event at Temple where we watched an episode of VeggieTales, and I have no idea why. But I'm pretty sure
was it the Purim story? Did you get to see the version of Esther with the Isle of Perpetual Tickling?
I'm pretty sure the zucchini and or cucumber turned into a supervillain at one point, so it's whichever one that was.
That was the asparagus, I think.
Well, that's not the point. The point is, I have seen this movie many times, especially in college or during COVID when I was away from my family and I couldn't do Seder with them. I would just sit down and turn on the Prince of Egypt, and that's how I would celebrate Passover.
Okay, so I am also the other Jew, for anyone who's forgotten somehow. And obviously I was raised doing Passover Seder with the other Jewish family on the block across the street who we were close to sometimes my grandparents before they stopped snowbirding and down in Florida a million years ago. And I actually don't celebrate Passover. I am an observant Jew, but in true fashion, as a Jew, I have my own way of doing things. And one of them is not doing a Passover Seder, but I will explain why when we talk about the actual story of Exodus and Passover and then get to Prince of Egypt. One of the things that I'm putting my Jew hat on now, first of all, at least I am going to use the words either Tanakh or, if I'm specifically referring, which is the whole of what Christianity refers to as the Old Testament, which is just what we use. So Tanakh, that's the word for the whole thing. And then if I'm just referring to Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, I might say the 5 books of Moses. I humbly request that y'all call it the Jewish Bible or the Tanakh or the Torah. Old Testament is a really weighted term. Most of the big differences in the way that I would tell the story versus a Jew brought up in another tradition versus a Christian, a Catholic versus pick your favorite branch of Protestantism versus someone from any one of the sects of Islam. They're all going to tell it slightly differently. But first bit of trivia on this one, though, I suspect most people who know this film are aware of this, that when they were getting ready to make the film, they brought in theologians and religion scholars representing the 3 Abrahamic religions, so they wouldn't defend anybody and so they could be inclusive. But one of the things that is great about this movie is that it still is telling the Jewish story. It's not including some of the stuff that Christianity adds to it, and I don't know if Islam adds to it per se, but they did still tell an actual story from the Jewish perspective of the Tanakh rather than the Christian perspective of the Old Testament.
Yes, we'll definitely get into just the amount of effort that was put into this movie, which, getting all those scholars in on this was definitely part of that.
Well, I'm just going to take my moment to plant my flag here and say Brenda Chapman's Oscar for Brave is actually a retroactive Oscar for this movie. Thank you very much for coming to my TED Talk. No further questions.
I wholeheartedly agree. Yeah.
Does we explain who that is?
The director. That's the director. I was literally looking it up.
Yeah.
There we go.
I've got
she is one of 3 credited directors for The Prince of Egypt, the other 2 being Steve Hickner and Simon Wells. But Brenda Chapman.
And Brenda Chapman.
I stand.
I believe Brenda Chapman was also story supervisor on The Lion King prior to this, if I remember correctly.
Oh my gosh.
So I wonder if that's how the Hans Zimmer connection factors in, because Hans Zimmer scored both of those films.
Well, Hans Zimmer scores all kinds of stuff, and it's always kind of fun.
I have complicated feelings on Hans Zimmer, but let's not discount Steven Schwartz, because this is Steven Schwartz's best
Oh my
score.
God.
Sorry, Wicked. Sorry,
absolutely.
Pippin.
Sorry, Wicked.
This
Sorry,
is it.
Hunchback. I love you both, but
Godspell. He did Godspell also. I agree with Sam that this is his best score. I had forgotten how hard this movie goes.
It hits the gas immediately and never really stops.
Yeah,
this is such an impressively paced movie.
Deliver Us. It starts with just goes right into it, and the songs did not need to go this hard.
Right? No, Stefan Schwartz is no slouch when it comes to religiously themed musical numbers.
I would like to say technically it starts with a very fun disclaimer, which I will now read if that's okay.
Oh no.
Technically, it starts with the motion picture you are about to see is an adaptation of the Exodus story. While artistic and historical license has been taken, we believe that this film is true to the essence, values, and integrity of a story that is a cornerstone for millions of people worldwide. The biblical story of Moses can be found in the book of Exodus. That was my mastermind reading piece. Hired me for all.
That disclaimer. It kind of reminds me of how the Thriller music video opens with that disclaimer of, look, I'm one of Jehovah's Witnesses and therefore I do not actually endorse the occult spiritistic imagery of this music video. So...
I feel like I will give more points than whatever that was, though.
Right? Yeah, no, this felt a bit less like a panic move. It felt more like this isn't a wholly accurate to Exodus retelling of Exodus, and
No,
but
of course
this
not.
we are still going to try and come across as a respectful adaptation.
I'll take it over the Ten Commandments and also whatever the fuck Ridley Scott is doing.
Oh, I wondered when we were going to bring that up.
Oh, yes. I think the big reason
Ilana-
why is that more than almost any other biblical movie I've ever seen, this movie is extremely show don't tell. Like, The Ten Commandments is an excellent movie in its own right, but a combo of the fact that, back then they just straight up couldn't visualize some of the stuff from the story they wanted to depict, and also because they had a lot of, dramatic old school Hollywood actors like Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner, it's very tell instead of show. A lot of the miracles, plagues, what have you, are described verbally post hoc in the Ten Commandments, whereas in The Prince of Egypt, it's extremely visually told. And honestly,
And
to me, that's
how?
part of what makes this movie so powerful to me. Have you ever heard the saying about this movie? I'm an atheist and I still think this movie's amazing. That's my position on this, believe it or not. I was not raised religious. I don't really consider myself a person of faith. I do not therefore scorn people of faith, though. But I will say that even as a child, I remember finding this movie incredibly captivating, and even rewatching it, this might be one of my all-time favorite movies. Not just musicals, not just animated pictures, not just biblical retellings or anything like that, or just religious retellings in general, to be honest. This is one of my favorite films, certainly from that time period. It's really impressive how much it holds up. Really, the only thing that I would really call dated about it are the two pop songs over the end credits.
Oh, but those are always, they're dated as soon as they
Well,
come out.
oh,
Yeah,
exactly.
films,
You know
always.
it's late 90s because, we got Mariah Carey, Whitney Houston, and Boyz II Men singing us out during the end credits. That's how you know this is the late
Somebody
90s.
has to perform the song at the Oscars to get people to watch.
Exactly. So I can't exactly be cynical about it, especially when, let's be frank, those were all good singers. So,
Honestly.
as cheesy and dated as they sound production-wise, the singing is great.
Yeah, because that's the thing too with it's not dissimilar to how they changed basically any song that they're trying to make into the big pop single.
Oh yeah,
unfortunately.
at least since the 80s, it was the norm. If you had a musical or if you had a main theme in your score, you turned it into a pop ballad to play during the end credits.
I am going to fight for Mariah Carey and Whitney Houston's version of When You Believe. It slaps, and it should not be discounted as a mere pop redefinition.
That's
It felt way less like a paycheck than some other stuff from around that same time, let's be frank.
Well, if we're talking about quick paychecks and the wild thing done with this music, it is important to note that there were 3 versions of this album that came out. There was the Countryfied inspired Prince of Egypt album, I believe the gospel inspired Prince of Egypt album, and the normal one. They tried everything to appeal to every single possible demographic.
It's not necessarily shocking to me. I mean, this was 1998 when this movie came out, so...
Well, excuse me, they were tribute albums to the film.
yeah,
Technically.
but still,
So
Oh,
I
okay.
suspect that some of it had to do with the fact that they wanted to be able to tell a biblical story, which most Americans would have some connection to. So they did want to make sure that they covered the gamut of Jews, Christians, Muslims from that angle, and then also people who aren't religious to just see it because it is a good film and spread that net real wide.
and weirdly enough, the movie itself doesn't really suffer for it, and actually didn't end up doing quite as well as they would have liked, which, I don't know, it's some kind of cruel irony.
And the thing is that you can only sanitize this stuff to a point before it becomes incomprehensible. They don't pull their punches in this movie about plagues, starting with Deliver Us for the actual film, etc. They're not pulling any punches with this one. They're presenting, here's the story. We're not going to try to connect like the ancient Egyptians to like modern Egyptians, which is great. We're telling this because this story is biblical and has significance because of that. We're going to try to do it in a way that appeals to all of the people whose religion includes this story, and then spread the net really wide so everybody knows, because you had to imagine them sitting at the boardroom table going like, is this really gonna sell? Because even with the stats of how many people in this country consider themselves to be Christian, whatever their belief level is, and how often they go to church, not to mention the less populace but still important Jews and Muslims. So it's like going like, how are we going to sell this to religious people? Because we don't want to offend them, but we also don't want to offend non-religious people. And so I think that kind of affected the way
the key balance was having to be struck there.
Yeah.
From the perspective of someone who's irreligious, I think they bounced it extremely well. Like, I really appreciate how effectively the film conveys the awe and power of the divinity that is from Exodus, but without relying entirely on it for emotional connection. Like, Moses does not feel compelled to pity how the Hebrews are enslaved because he got the vision from the burning bush. The vision from the burning bush motivates him to be proactive now about it, but he already noticeably is horrified seeing how the Hebrews are suffering, but he also still gets called out by Aaron later on about how he didn't really care until he found out those were his people.
I do want to point out one thing that I feel is a weak part of this movie, and that is Moses's dream sequence. Now, normally I love it when an animated film switches into a different style, like the hieroglyphics.
Oh, wow, really? That was actually one of my favorite parts.
For me, I don't know if it was the pacing of that sequence. I don't know if it's the stylistic shift, but something about it makes it just a little too cartoony to impress the ultimate horror of it. And I think it's much more effective when it's just Moses coming to that mural and seeing literal infanticide glorified. I think that the dream sequence is just laying it on a little too thick.
I can understand thinking that, because the fact that there is still the glorification right there in the actual palace of what's been going on to supposedly control the population, or whatever the excuse really was. Yeah, it's very well played out just in that scene all on its own. But I think part of why it ended up playing that way was because the writers, they maybe felt like they were in a bit of a corner there, because we still need his denial phase voiceover musical number.
He needs to reject the call.
We also need him to reconsider the fact that maybe he is in denial and see right there in front of him, wait, this is actually kind of screwed. And I will say, it is an amazing payoff later when, Moses is indicating to Ramesses what the final plague is going to be, and we literally get a callback to the dramatic fast pan across the carved hieroglyphics, except now Ramesses' son is literally between the jaws of the two crocodiles. Now that's an example of laying it on pretty thick in this movie that nonetheless I think worked absolutely beautifully in here.
The visual
really, I really love how much is told just through the animation of the characters' faces rather than dialogue. Of course, the one everyone points to is when Moses returns the ring and Ramesses just goes through all these emotions before finishing with determination to just get back at him. But that's just one of many moments where there's so much said without words, just through beautifully subtle facial animation in this film.
So I think for me, like I told Jazz, that I think the best shot in the entire film is when she drops the basket in the river and her scarf is blowing in her face and the tears are down her face. Like, that is possibly the most beautiful moving shot of the whole film.
And then they come back to it with Miriam.
They come back to that one when he bumps into Aaron and Miriam and she sings the lullaby, and then she just kind of slides to the ground, and it ends with her hair kind of blowing across her face and the tear, so that it's mimicking that shot with Yocheved.
It's literally the same pattern of tear. Comes up, there's already a tear down out of the left, and then one comes out of the right. It's the exact same pattern.
And then that's Brenda Chapman's voice. Brenda Chapman laid that down as a scratch track, and it was so good that they were like, let's keep it. Let's not have Miriam's singing voice, Sally Dworsky, do it, because Sandra Bullock's great, but she can't sing.
While we are on the subject of singers, and specifically of Yocheved, I would like to point out that Yocheved was performed by Ofra Haza. In 2023, Rolling Stone ranked her at number 186 on 200 greatest singers of all time. She was a very famous Israeli singer, and she actually did deliver us in 19 languages.
Oh, wow.
And also, they thought she was so beautiful that Yochevet's character model was designed off of her voice actress.
Yeah, I've heard about that too.
And unfortunately, she delayed treatment for her complications with HIV while she was recording all of those different versions. She ended up literally giving her life for her art, which is just...
Yeah. What a beautiful performance, though. I remember it was a popular thing amongst movie music snobs in particular in the 2000s and a bit into the 2010s to be cynical about the wailing voice trope that was used to sound quote-unquote exotic in movies. But man, Ofra Hausa, she delivers that so beautifully. When I see that close-up shot of the wind and her tears and then we follow up with her wailing voice in the background, that gets me every single time. It is so powerful. And while I'm in music nerd moment for a second, can I just say that one of my pet peeves in music, especially religious music in terms of its use, is what's known as the Picardy third, where you'll have a song that's in a minor key, but right at the last chord, it resolves into a parallel major chord by just raising the third of the chord. This is me just talking music nerd stuff. Basically, it's an attempt to, at the last minute, try and make the end sound happy when people associate minor keys with sounding sad. And almost always, it sounds like a cheap cop-out. But the way Deliver Us ends with that Picardy third is so gorgeous that I completely lose any cynicism I have about that music theory thing.
So on that, and this is music theory here, which is just fun. Most Jewish prayers, including the way that the Torah is chanted in services, but also the folk music from all over the place, are based on minor-ish scale.
I've heard some of those tunes.
And
it's not so straightforward.
The vocalizations that are included in some of the places sound like the kind of wordless vocalizations that are in both liturgical and more secular Jewish music. And Schwartz is Jewish and has written the music for a bunch of religious-based musicals. So it is unlikely that the fact that things like Deliver Us and are in a minor key, and I believe that
Isn't the Plagues also?
yes, I think it is. And I think the only music that is sung by the Hebrews that's not in minor is When You Believe, which
Yeah,
is...
the Ashir al Adonai interlude, right?
Well, no, the whole song is in major.
It starts on a minor chord but resolves major, yes.
Where does Through Heaven's Eyes fit into this? Because that's one of my favorite songs, not just because I have a massive fucking crush on Brian Stokes Mitchell and his voice.
That is also
Thank you,
major.
Bex.
That also
wondering
resolves
who it
on a
was
major
that did
chord,
this
on
in this
an E major to be more precise.
Well, it's an interesting, not quite left field, but it is not a song sung by the Egyptians or the Jews.
The Hebrews.
It is
Because
sung
the
by Midianites, who are, they're there, a lot of help.
They are not Abrahamic?
Yeah, they are neither believers in the ancient Egyptian pantheon, nor were they religiously affiliated with the Hebrews.
No, they have a priest.
But he's not one of the priests that Judaism would develop after this period. The tribe that Zipporah is attached to are called the Midianites, and it is not entirely certain as to what that referred to, whether they lived in a space that was called Midian or whether that was an unrelated name. They were, but yes, no, they're not Jews or Hebrews, to be more accurate, because I think either all of our sources or almost all of our sources about the Midianites are biblical and don't really talk about them as in any kind of detail, because that's not how they're discussed. So we don't know like what they did or whatever, but the idea of you've got the story that, you know, we're telling in there, and Zipporah leaves her people to go with him, and that's...
And I think this movie does a really great job of developing the relationship to the point where it's like, yeah, of course she's going to stick by him, even though this isn't really her circus or monkey.
And quite frankly, if we're just talking about the function that Through Heaven's Eyes serves in the movie, it is functionally there, and it's functionally, well, it still remains like sonically connected to the rest of the piece. I think it is there to serve as a space for a breather from the very heavy story, as well as reframing Moses' mindset and his new mindset as he's growing older, as well as a falling in love montage for him and Zipporah.
We talked already about how even people who are not of faith still often really love this movie, and I really do think that is one of the secret sauces there. Specifically the fact that they really did reframe this as a story of brothers being torn apart because of the messed up system they're in. And yes, Ilana, I'm sure you have thoughts on that.
So in the Tanakh, it specifically says that when Moses comes back, it is Pharaoh's daughter that finds baby Moses, and there are a couple of Ramesses involved, and then there's the whole fact that the story is connected to the story of Joseph, and in the text it says, and then there came a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, because Joseph was respected, and his brothers and all of their kids that came and then multiplied came to Egypt and were not originally enslaved. So there's much debate about whether, like, what that actually means, because, you know, he was popular and well known, so, like, how many generations do you need? Or does the word know mean, like, give a shit about? Because that could be it. And then the status of the Jews changed to, okay, so you're slaves now, and also there are too many of you, and that's why you're going to do that culling Moses winds up being saved from. But like, there's multiple Ramses, and like there's like a generational like off tilt.
There's an entire Wikipedia page theorizing who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus.
Well, so that ties into a larger problem. But in the Bible, it's when Moses comes back, God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and that's why he says no. And I actually found it fascinating that, thinking about this as an adult, because I watched this film a lot as a kid, because it was one of the only pieces of visual media that was actually like good to watch as a Jew if you want religious stuff. By making it so that the Pharaoh and Moses, by shifting the Pharaoh's motivations to, he's got an inferiority complex up the wazoo because of his dad, which if my dad talked that way and sounded like Patrick Stewart, I would have a complex too. For those of you listening, got a couple people nodding enthusiastically.
Well, yeah, Patrick Stewart. You don't disobey Patrick Stewart. He's Patrick Stewart.
He's the captain.
When your parents are
Shut up,
Patrick
Leslie.
Stewart and Helen Mirren, there's not much you can do.
Right?
Yeah.
An acclaimed Starfleet captain and the Queen of England.
Yeah, well, yeah. So I thought it was really interesting that they shifted. Like, they spend that first chunk of the film doing things that fall under the category of we want you to get the vibe. So they establish the brotherly connection. It kind of removes God
From the equation? Yeah, I could see that.
Controversial statement. There are times in the Tanakh where God is kind of the bad guy.
Yeah, I mean, babies were killed.
Yeah.
There's other significant.
Should we talk about the flooding the world?
flood.
Should we talk about the book of Job? Should we talk about...
No.
Again, another thing I really appreciate about this movie is that, like, it doesn't really sugarcoat how fucked some things are, including the stuff that was supposedly for the greater good because God did it.
Moses breaks down when Ramesses' son dies. I mean, in another life, that was gonna be his nephew.
Right, like, the way Passover is done, holy crap, that is so haunting, the way that plays out. That it's one of the few scenes with no music at all, just sound and the muted colors, that monochromatic cool blue. It's just
That
Oh,
exhale, and you're like,
so
ooh,
Yeah.
no.
Those exhales.
Oh, yeah,
I actually got into
that
an
death
argument
rattle
with my
noise.
brothers at one point about whether I would be the one to die or they would be the one to die, because depending on the translation with the Christians, you're like, is it the firstborn or the firstborn son?
yeah, man,
the
that's
Jewish Orthodox interpretation is sons, but that's because they don't care about Judaism. Has
Women.
It's anti, woman bits.
As I was also about to bring up, because one thing that I do know from how Exodus is written in the actual scriptures that is definitely not adhered to in The Prince of Egypt is that Aaron is more of a prominent character in book form because he's the one who does most of the speaking.
Yes, this is my 2-minute rant. We need to talk about Aaron and why this version of him isn't great. They fully rip his part from the story. Also, it could just be my problem with Jeff Goldblum's performance. I can't unhear it and just think of, that's Jeff Goldblum. Like, everyone else, I'm okay with them. Like, I can feel them disappearing into their roles. But I'm watching it, and it sucks also, because Jeff Goldblum is also one of the only, like, Jewish cast members in it.
Yeah.
But that's Dr. Ian Malcolm in my Torah story.
Yeah. I will say, in Goldblum's defense, that when it comes to the moments when he is supposed to convey fear in response to stuff, I do believe that. I am still hearing Jeff Goldblum's voice coming out of that character. I don't really see the character, I just hear his voice. But I do believe the emotions of Aaron whenever he says a line. It's just, that is the most obviously in-your-face celebrity cast member in there.
Moses is disabled in the Torah, and
so
he's not... Yeah, go off, Ilana.
Yeah, so Moses has an issue with speaking because one of the bits of story that they skipped, which is fine, is when Pharaoh's daughter collects the basket, they want to prove that he isn't going to try to go for the throne from the son who I guess would be the Pharaoh's daughter's, her brother. So they put this baby in front of, there's a pile of gold and a pile of hot coal. And this is also one of these things that's like elaborated outside of the actual liturgical text. They put the baby down, and the assumption is if the baby goes for the gold, the baby will want power, though really a baby would want shiny things, and which would say to them not let the Pharaoh's daughter adopt the kid, because there's a debate about it in the original story. And an angel comes down, because this is what angels do in the Old Testament, and pushes the baby's hand so that Moses puts his hand in the hot coals instead, and he puts his hand in the hot coals, and then he puts his fingers that he just burned in his mouth, and he burns the inside of his mouth badly enough that he has what would fall under, I guess, a speech impediment. And that's why in the Tanakh, Aaron does all the talking to like Pharaoh, because Moses can't really orate. But that causes a problem for a film. It's kind of difficult from a Hollywood perspective to hire your Moses and then have him barely...
Considering what happened to Val Kilmer, that's actually kind of tragic foreshadowing.
Yeah.
I was about to say, because, yeah, I remember Val Kilmer, he developed some sort of cancer, I think, or
Throat
something,
cancer.
and so...
Yeah.
Yeah, and...
Also, Val Kilmer's great in this movie.
Yeah.
He really is.
Oh, absolutely.
I think
We're
for
talking
most
about
of the
that
actors
one,
in this
yeah.
movie, it's one of their best performances.
For a lot of the cast.
And the only ones I wouldn't say that for are ones that had such incredible careers that, of course, you wouldn't say this was their best role.
Sandra Bullock.
Agreed. But yeah, I love how this, for all I know, is the debut of the Ralph Fiennes yell.
Ray Fiennes did his own singing, which I find fun and good. But even more fun and gooder, grammar, Michelle Pfeiffer also did her own singing. Because as we all know,
Right.
Michelle Pfeiffer is a musicals girl, first and foremost. Those who saw Grease
yes.
2 will always remember.
Oh my god,
yes,
I can't
I
believe
do
you
know
reached
that
for
was true.
that and not for Hairspray.
If you're going to do Grease 2, I might as well bring up the fact that she did, in fact, sing a song for the Murder on the Orient Express movie she was in. What the hell, Bex?
I reach for what I reach for, Sam.
Yeah, man.
And
this
technically,
was
Grease
my first
2
time.
was closer in the community consciousness than Hairspray was at that time, because Hairspray hadn't come out yet.
Yeah, this was my first time hearing Michelle Pfeiffer sing when I first saw this movie. I think this was my first time for all of the voices involved, now that I think about it. Kind of going back to my point about how this film acknowledges, again, just how fucked some of the stuff is, I really appreciate not only is Passover so beautifully, hauntingly portrayed, but the aftermath of it is also beautifully, hauntingly portrayed in its own right. You get that pause after the sound dissipates, and then this choir of weeping from the parents and all of that.
When you're saying
And then, of course-
Passover, you're specifically referring to the last plague, right?
Yes, the final plague. Specifically what I mean is the final plague. Yes, the death of the firstborn.
being passed over, which is where the name of the holiday comes from for anyone who is unfamiliar.
Yes, I love how, again, right after Moses is finally being told by Ramesses his people can go, again, the heartbreak in Ramesses' voice, realizing what his stubbornness cost him. And Moses right after feeling so terrible for all because these were innocent lives that were just taken, and he hates this too. The fact that he just collapses on the ground and sobs for a moment, and the fact that he's still clearly so despondent of that. Honestly, it's almost mood whiplash when the song When You Believe begins. Almost, but
I would like to point out that Moses and Ramesses probably killed a lot of people in that opening scene with the sandstorm where we're introduced to them in the race.
Yeah.
oh yeah.
That's
just
supposed to be us introducing Moses at the point when he needs to get his shit together.
Like, it shows how relatively young and carefree and stupid they were as youngins, basically. I like to think of it as like that time period's equivalent of like two frat boys going on a joyride or something.
I mean, that whole chariot sequence, it includes an upskirt shot of Ramesses' ass.
I forgot about that. So I'm watching this movie 10 a.m. in the morning. And I'm getting through it, and then that happens, and I'm like, in a children's movie? Children's movie with a grain of salt. This is not a kid's movie.
And also, it's DreamWorks. They got away with a lot more back then.
Yeah, like, it's PG, but it's like a hard PG. Like, sure, they don't show blood on the knives, but they still show the guy going up with it raised to a crib, so it's like, doesn't leave that much to the imagination, you know?
Look, maybe it's just because I grew up hearing these stories, and I'm sure Bex and Ilana grew up hearing them as well. I know for a fact that they did, actually, because that's why we're talking about this. But yeah, this is just another Sunday. It's fine. It's Sunday. For me, Sunday. Anyway, you know, your mileage may vary on what day of the week your service is on, but for me, it's Sunday.
Yeah. I was going to say that most synagogues, at least, that I am familiar with, and, you know, that people have told me about their experiences growing up, they never pull punches about the Tanakh stories.
For sure. We had children's services at my synagogue.
Yeah, we had children's service, and it was going over when, you know, whatever the Torah portion for that week, they would be telling the story to the kids in age appropriate ways, and the littlest ones got crayons, and like, I mean, but a lot of Jews don't.
There were little plays being put on. I remember the Jonah and the Whale one fondly.
VBS, we had stuff like that, but they didn't, like, hold punches. They were like, this happened, but, you know, God said it was supposed to happen, so it's fine.
Yeah,
Speaking of God, I would love to talk about how God's voice in this movie is also Val Kilmer.
Yeah, that was definitely an interesting decision.
It's not just that it's Val Kilmer. The other cast members speak it too, and they're layered under it.
When I was watching with Addie, I was mentioning and here's where Val Kilmer, you know, plays God, and she was saying, you know, that's odd, and I was like, wait, listen to the way they process it, and you'll see why it actually worked. I like the idea that, and I don't know if this is what they were thinking, but this is just what comes to mind for me, that God is all things and all things are in God concept, but also the idea that there is a modern debate about historical figures and mytho-historical figures, which is what I'm going to call Moses here. No one strangle me. Religions, stories are myths, whether they are actively practiced or not. So when people hear God talking to them, like the modern scientific establishment wants to go, well, that's their own brain talking to them in some form, whether it's schizophrenia or psychosis or some other something. And some people see that as being proof against the existence of God, and some people, you know, have different ways of interpreting it and whatever. I thought it was very cool that they had Val Kilmer as the primary voice for God, because they, first of all, they fiddle with it enough that it's not like blatantly obvious, but it also, it's like God is talking to him with his own voice. And then also just from a cinematic perspective, it's fun, and I compared it to how Cumberbatch plays both Doctor Strange and Dormammu, the bad guy, in the first Doctor Strange film, and I just, you know, I loved that, because from a narrative perspective, it's just really fun.
It's also worth noting they did the same kind of thing with Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments, actually.
I thought what was interesting was the look of utter disappointment on Moses' mother's face when Zipporah falls in the water. Like, I know this is a little, like, different spot in the movie, but it just occurred to me, like, Zipporah falls in the water at the banquet, and their mother is just, like, shaking her head like this.
Yeah, that's a weird moment, considering then she has the whole musical number about, yeah, now you know that you come from the people that we've enslaved, just forget about it because you get to be a prince and we love you.
I was thinking maybe that was her shaking her head at her son's antics.
Yeah.
And not so much this poor slave. Because she didn't give a crap.
It's more like, hey, that's bad optics. You're not acting like a prince by doing that.
We gotta get PR in here. Speaking of PR, Hotep and Hoy. First of all, today I discovered neither Martin Short nor Steve Martin are Jewish.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's one of those things where it's like you would.
I don't know why that was a question for me, but I was like, surely one of them. No.
I basically appreciate how, for all intents and purposes, they're a Vegas-style magic act.
Yeah.
What they do, it's very much like a Vegas magic show. It's very David Copperfield, very Chris Angel, what they're doing. Like, literally smoke and mirrors, how they literally will, like, take the blinds all the way down for the windows except one, and then they refract that off a mirror to create a spotlight effect.
Was a real thing. That was actually a thing they did in ancient Egypt to get light around those big stone structures, was to bounce it with mirrors.
This is
That's
true.
a real thing.
That makes sense.
But,
It makes
so
perfect sense.
One of the things that's like a surprisingly big change to me is in fact the way that they have Hotep and Hoy as like knowing that they are, to use the Yiddish word shysters,
Charlatans?
to know that they're that it's a con, which is very strange because the thing is that in Exodus, they have power. The interaction where Moses' staff turns into a snake, and then two of the Egyptian priests turn their staffs into snakes, and the god of the Hebrews, a snake, eats them both and then turns back into a staff. That happens in the text, actually, which so a lot of other detail that people know doesn't. And the idea was in the Old Testament, if you read it closely, one interpretation is that there are actually gods. It's that you're supposed to hold the Jewish God before any other, which implies that they recognize the divinity of their neighbors' gods. They just thought that their God was better. And so the fact that Hotep and Hoy are presented as knowing that what they are doing is fake, as opposed to believing in the reality of it, even if it is magic tricks and not actually the power of something divine, I thought was a weird choice, and it felt very anti anything that's not Abrahamic, but
Yeah.
I
Very
feel
much
like-
reinforced the idea there is only one God.
We are in a post-Paradise Lost world.
Yeah, I feel like that is the one way in which their desperation to make sure they don't offend anybody of Abrahamic religions perhaps went a little too far in that, because the very devout would probably take umbrage with the implication that, no, the Egyptian gods also have power. It just so happens they didn't win this round, which does kind of suck.
It's interesting how sometimes it's kind of implied and other times outright shown that it's a con, but because we have those other moments showing it's a con, we are left to figure out on our own, oh, well, how did they do that trick? Because again, when they do their own version of transforming the staffs into snakes, there's a bright flash. And if you know how magic tricks work, you can easily imagine, oh, during the flash they switched.
Personally, I kind of like to headcanon that Ra and the other members of the Enneatic Pantheon were like, these two chuckleheads are who we have running our temple. You know what? Let's take a vacation. We're gonna take a quick little vacation. Just leave them to it, okay?
Especially when
Well,
the
so
biggest complaint
it's-
that Steve Martin could come up with is my new thing.
I mean-
My favorite half-baked ad-lib from any
Yeah, well.
comedian in an animated movie has to be, oh, my new thing!
it is true to say that there were periods in ancient Egypt where there was an issue with corruption in the priesthood, and the priesthood and the pharaoh were often in conflict because the pharaoh was the living embodiment of Ra, but then there were also the priests, and so it's kind of like having a little argument there. But I agree with Jazz that it really kind of shits on anybody who has faith in some divine that isn't the Abrahamic God. I mean, Martin and Short are fantastic. So I wish they'd found two Jewish comedians. It's not like they're thin on the ground, but at least like everybody is actually some shade of brown instead of European white in this, because that is a problem that happens in a lot of other retellings of stories from both the Tanakh and then, you know, the Christian Bible as a whole, when, you know, the white Jesus problem, and like everything is cast with, you know, white people when they should be brown people.
That's not saying that there hasn't been white Stephen Schwartz as the Prince of Egypt, because there has, and it came under fire. And it got a complete retool.
For good reason.
And I'm not going to talk about that production. But we cannot talk about that because I will descend into rage, and Passover also happens next year. That's a conversation for next year. I would also like to touch on, while I have the microphone, I would really like to touch on just how beautiful for a relationship that isn't in the Torah, technically, of the brotherhood of Ramses and Moses. I love how it plays out, and I love how it fractures. I think a lot of the
I really think that's the secret sauce of what makes this movie as impactful to the
relationship dynamics in this movie are all very good.
Absolutely. This film already has tons of like amazing match fades, for example, but I also love how the film echoes as well. The way the film does echoes and callbacks is just so gorgeous. Just little things like the two brothers having a conversation. Moses is at ground level, and Ramesses is literally sitting in the lap of a god, statue-wise. And the first time, you know, it's just brotherly banter of, why do I always have to be in trouble? And then the next time, it's so much more bitter, so much more dark. And again, you have that moment of such bittersweet nostalgia where Ramesses literally just says, why can't things be the way they were before? And it breaks my heart every time. It's so beautifully played.
Hopping back to visuals for a second, I think my favorite shot in the film is literally when the Red Sea closes over the Egyptian army because Ramesses has decided to come back, when he's reaching out to literally try to hold the river back because his hands are open and spread, and you see the water kind of shooting through between his fingers, and it's just so perfect to show that, you know, Pharaoh has no control in this situation. And there are shots like that all over the place. So like there's the shot of first Seti and then and his wife standing in front of one of the statues, so you see his silhouette and then the silhouette of the statue behind him, the big one.
Yeah, the parallel shot.
Yeah, that one. And then when they do that again, when Moses has asked Ramesses to release the Hebrews, and so you've got him with Seti's face behind him, and then his own face is in a larger statue above that. But just the fact that you're seeing
visual symbolism,
like you're seeing Seti leaning on all the things he's taught him, leaning on him as he makes the decision not to free the Hebrews, and so that's also like intense.
Yeah, again, he calls back to that bit where Seti literally says, one weak link can break the chain of a mighty dynasty, and in that later scene he says, I will not be the weak link.
Yeah, this film relies really successfully on internal callbacks. They use it incredibly effectively.
Since we did bring up Seti, I do want to kind of bring up how fascinated I am by his characterization in this movie, and like the filmmakers had even apparently said, specifically when Moses finds the mural, they really kind of went back and forth. It's like, okay, do we want him to be a straight up villain here? Or do we want to maybe give him some sympathy? And I think they made a really fascinating decision by making it seem like, yeah, he's regretful, but then have him say that one last gut punch of a line.
Oh, my son. They were only slaves.
And I think the reason that was so smart is because it's really making it clear. It's like systems of oppression are not necessarily upheld by pure evil mustache-twirling villains. They are upheld by people who are convinced that they're doing what is necessary, if not out and out the right thing. And that's one of the reasons why it is such a bastard to undo these systems that do actively harm people.
It's not like we can relate or anything with all of us living in basically the largest empirical power in the world and existing at a point when people are pushing back against that empirical concept and you hate it.
Well, in a silly little palate cleanser topic change, would you all like to hear about how this movie is inexplicably intertwined with Shrek?
If we must.
Yes, indeed.
I think we should.
Do we have
should hear
to?
this.
We must! So, it was
It's integral to DreamWorks history.
Yes, and this is not an urban legend. This has been well documented. If you were an animator, storyboarder, whatever, underperforming when working on The Prince of Egypt, they would send you to go work on Shrek, which no one had confidence in the time. It was colloquially known as getting Shrek'd.
Heard about that
So
one.
they did the same thing that Disney did to animators on Pocahontas, and they sent them to work on The Lion King?
Yes. Except
Basically.
it was so
And
different.
wouldn't you know it?
Because-
And wouldn't you know it? Jeffrey Katzenberg.
Because one was going from 2D to 2D. The other was going from Prince of Egypt to Shrek. And listen, I have nothing against Shrek. Shrek is a fabulous movie. But I do think it's hilarious that it was seen as a punishment when Shrek ended up vastly outperforming Prince of Egypt. And that is how this beautiful musical and Shrek are forever linked.
Well, that and the fact that Jeffrey Katzenberg was the criminal mastermind executive behind both projects, both in this context and in that Disney context earlier. And this is yet again an example where the project that everyone thought was going to be the big Oscar buzz movie kind of was, but the other movie was the one that ended up actually having a long-lasting cultural impact and being a massive hit. Like, Prince of Egypt was the closest thing DreamWorks ever got to a profitable 2D animated movie, and even then, not really.
Hello, I hate all of this.
Yeah, basically. For one thing, I hate to think that Prince of Egypt is in a similar position as fucking Pocahontas. Fuck that shit. This movie is leagues better.
Oh yeah, Prince of Egypt is way less problematic than Pocahontas, especially in
Princess-
hindsight.
Prince of Egypt also has a better direct-to-video follow-up than Pocahontas does. Joseph, King of Dreams. It's underrated.
Okay. I want to talk about history, because we've danced around this a little bit, but one of the things that makes making movies of biblical stories difficult, the thing we call the Torah, 5 books of Moses, there were at least 4 versions that were mashed together, and that's how Judaism codified one single version. Judaism has commentaries on the Tanakh, and then commentaries on those commentaries that are part of the liturgical tradition and inform on, you know, these stories and things. But one of the things that becomes a problem with a lot of the historical events in the Old Testament is that, like, there is no evidence that there was ever a large group of Hebrews in ancient Egypt at any time. There's no documentation or anything in the archaeological record to indicate that there was ever a mass exodus from Egypt of any group of peoples. And, like, the problem of which pharaoh is the pharaoh that Sam mentioned, and some other stuff, like, doesn't match with what else we know about. And so, unlike the tunnels the Maccabees used are still there and you can tour them if you visit Jerusalem, or even the fact that there is a wall, or the remains of a wall, that was probably the wall of Jericho that was blown down. And, like, we know where Troy would have been. The archaeological record backs all this stuff up. Passover is intensely political if you look at it from a certain angle. And then we're now going to get a touch very gently on current events. The observance of Passover, the way that it is generally observed and has been for a while, really emphasizes this kind of call to go to Israel. And so it got used by both the original and the modern Zionist movement, and quotes from Exodus and stuff like that. And especially after the events of Passover itself, the traveling through the desert to the land that was promised and all of this stuff is really complicates the issue of the existence and continued difficulties in Israel because England needed a place to dump all of these Jews. And the thing is that at least for many supporters of the creation of Israel in England and the United States, as well as other people, was they didn't want any of these Jews after World War II anyway. And the idea was they wanted to just dump them somewhere. And my relationship with organized religious Judaism is complicated as someone who was presumed to be female shaped and is still not male now, and was raised in a synagogue where the fact that I was perceived as a girl meant that there were things I wasn't allowed to do, but my parents were at home raising me to be, a feminist. And so there was this deep conflict. And so I look into this stuff myself, which is how I kind of deprogrammed, feels like too heavy a word, but it's appropriate. The specific stuff about Israel and anti-Palestinian bias that is very common still in a lot of Jews, and it's one of those things that's in the forefront of people's minds now, because talking about what's going on in Gaza can be very complicated, even between Jews, without bringing anybody else into it. There are a lot of Jews that in the United States and around the world who were taught that Israel is the Jewish homeland. They represent international Judaism. They have every right to be there. And not always, but more often than not, there is a distinct anti-Palestinian and anti-Muslim in general bias that comes into that can, and then you get people that get to college and are like, oh, hold on a second. And I was one of those.
For me, well, especially this past Passover that has been passing and is currently going on because it ends tomorrow? ?
Editor Jasmine here from the future. I wish.
There have been a lot of conversations sprouting up everywhere, to the point that my beloved grandpa, who still uses an opt-online email, sent me an email with the subtitle, "You are not alone!" ! With a news article about how all the Jewish families are dealing with this stuff. The unlearning could also be hard when it has been entrenched in our temples, in our day schools for decades.
Yes. Judaism actively encourages everyone, to participate in the process of learning and analyzing Torah.
Jews are supposed to ask questions and argue. It is literally biblically written into our nature.
The stuff around the Exodus and Passover is what's used by a lot of fundamentalist Jews to argue in favor of the Israeli government and military doing anything they think is necessary to justify kicking the Palestinians around, basically wiping out the West Bank. The disproportionate level of response to the attack from Hamas in October, and so with Jews, it's an issue of comparing the text that tells you that, you promised land with the text that says things like you should be to people who need it because you were slaves in the land of Egypt, which is the same story. And that is used by many liberal progressive Jews to
let all who are hungry come and eat.
The violence, response to violence cycle that we're all stuck in here. It's the same thing, and you can find verses that either support this stuff or, go against it. And then
one more interesting point that I would actually like to bring up is that it's interesting how actually quite a lot of the more negative portrayals from Exodus that I'm aware of, at least, a lot of them do seem to be kind of excised in The Prince of Egypt. And then by that I mean the film simply ends with Moses coming down with the 10 Commandments.
Are we sure it wasn't 15?
But we don't actually see how it wasn't really that positive of a reception at the time when he came with those tablets.
Or what happens later when they get to...
Yeah.
I know I said I wouldn't talk about this on the pod, but I have to. I think it is so funny that it ends with Moses coming down with the 10 Commandments, knowing the story that happens next. I'm just like,
So
For all
You could have
know,
ended
could
it.
be when he
End
comes down
it.
with, for all you know, it could be when he comes down with the second set, but that's all right.
apparently that was a mandate from no less than Steven Spielberg.
Really?
He was one of the three
Spielberg?
co-founders of DreamWorks.
Spielberg was the one who wanted the Prince of Egypt to end on Moses bringing down the Ten Commandments.
why?
Yeah, that's my
I
question.
don't know. It's Steven Spielberg.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting how that ended up being there, because I did see the Ten Commandments at a later time, the movie from 56, when I was in my teens, I think, and I was shocked to discover that when he delivered those commandments, it wasn't quite so great what happened afterwards, because I had no idea, because again, I was not raised religious. My only knowledge of the story of Exodus came from the Prince of Egypt growing up, because I saw it a couple times when I was a kid, because they figured, oh, it's animated, it must be kid-friendly, so, and they weren't entirely wrong, it's just kind of funny.
I mean, you
But,
don't want to know
yeah,
how
it's just
young
amusing
I
to think
was
about.
when they took me with the synagogue to the Holocaust Museum to the full exhibit, not the kids exhibit.
Yep.
Judaism does not pull its punches when it's
No.
teaching, and sometimes that is a
No,
little
first time I went
intense.
to the New York Holocaust Museum, I was 9. It was a sponsored thing. It was my entire Wednesday school class. They took us on a day trip to New York City. I was 9.
Parents did not want to shelter me that much either. They let me
But
see stuff that I think your
But
average
it's a bit
parent
of a
wouldn't let
I will
see.
say that's a bit of a difference between not being sheltered and like growing up and having to know your history that quickly.
Yeah.
I suppose
Absolutely
so.
a thing of privilege to be like, oh no, my kids' animated movies shouldn't be that scary. I want to shelter the little darlings.
Yeah, I honestly
It
hate
is.
that. And I also just hate the bias that people just assume because something's animated, it therefore is for kids, because that's
Oh, 100%.
that's bollocks.
Especially when you consider all the work that goes in. It took 10 animators 2 years to animate the Red Sea parting.
Right? Like, that was a
I think
huge
it's
step up in the use
phenomenal.
of mixing in CG with 2D. That was a big step up at the time.
For me, obviously, the reason that this movie works so well is that so much care and love was put into this movie. And from all sides, they just truly wanted... Nobody half-asses anything in this movie.
Oh, absolutely.
And-
This was a labor of love.
It's a good movie, right? And mid-millennial that I am, when I was growing up, it was one of the only, and even now, as talked about during the Hanukkah episode, there are very few pieces of visual media that are retellings of stories from the Tanakh that are actually from a Jewish perspective. And that's when you run into the issues with, like, you know, VeggieTales. And parents, it's an option to, you know, of an actual, like, this is a Jewish telling of this story, and so, like,
It's a really nice education for those of us who don't come from the Jewish community it's a good introduction to the story of Exodus and like a good education into the story itself that isn't from a Christian perspective.
Movie good. Score slaps.
Movie great. Score slaps.
they did not have to go that
Yeah,
hard, but they did.
Yeah.
They really did an amazing job with this film. I adore this film with all my heart.
Movie good. I think the camel animations are my favorite.
Oh gosh.
Oh man,
fair.
yeah, that was entertaining. I can't stress enough how impressed I am by this movie from my own perspective as someone irreligious. It's just so strong narratively. I feel almost every emotion. The animation is fantastic. I can't fathom how much work had to go into just storyboarding this movie, even compared to a lot of other 2D animated movies. Like, this is a film I wish I could rant about on my own time, to be honest, because there's still so much more I could be saying about it. It really is just that wonderful to me. I think this film is fantastic.
Yeah, I really feel like this is a really powerful movie no matter who you are. And if you haven't watched it because you feel like the religious story might not hit, think of it as the tale of two brothers who, not in blood but in bond, who are torn apart because they're on opposite sides of a conflict that no, there is in fact a right or wrong answer there. And it's gorgeous animation, gorgeous music, and yeah, go see it if you haven't already somehow. Y'all, we didn't even get to talk about the plague sequence or anything, in spite of the whole bit in the beginning.
Oh my god.
I kind of wish we had gotten.
I'm gonna put this into the innator. I'm gonna put this into the rotation, and I'll start off the plugs by saying that at some point, hopefully, we will cover this on 6 Degrees of Star Wars, available wherever pods are cast. The podcast that covers all the ways George Lucas's flagship franchise surrounds us, binds us, and penetrates us in the landscape of cinema. That's me.
In April, we just did our annual collaboration with Fantasy Worlds Elsewhere. We did a sequel to last year's game, Musica Universalis. This year was Book 2, Regenerational Trauma, GM'd by our very own Sam. And I was an NPC, as was Callie, and Jazz was in it. And you can watch either the full stream or watch it broken up into acts on our YouTube channel, or you can find us at worlds-elsewhere.com. Has all the links and stuff about our most recent show, and then we'll be doing new exciting things after that. So that's my pitch.
If you tuned into the Muppet Christmas Carol episode of this podcast, you might actually remember my voice as one of the singers for the karaoke of It Feels Like Christmas during the outro. Well, just so you know, that's something that I, in fact, largely do for a living. I am, in fact, a singer professionally, and you can follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/Leif Bradshaw Music. That's spelled Leif, by the way. And on Instagram at Leif Bradshaw Sings, and again, that's spelled Leif. And on the subject of podcasting, I am about to get a podcast started. Me and Brian Harris are co-creating a Disney-themed podcast called The Disney Outlands, a podcast where we discuss feature films, short films, episodes, and specials produced by the Disney company, but not found on their major streaming platforms. I'm going to be your guide on that journey through the lost and forgotten, the unloved and unappreciated. We've recorded our first pilot episode already, and we are about to record our second pilot soon, and hopefully that means within a month or two our first proper episode release is coming very soon. So stay tuned wherever podcasts are found.
Exciting.
And thank you so much, all of you, for having me on board, by the way. This was loads of fun. I hope more is coming.
You're always welcome. You're always welcome.
Well, thank you. Hopefully I'll have less tight of a schedule so I can get away with being caught in the act of tangenting more, and you call me out on that and make sure I get back on track.
Trust me, we're usually much friendlier to tangents. Go ahead, Callie.
I'm Callie, and I am the host of the podcast Postcards from Mystic Falls, a podcast where residents of Mystic Falls drag newcomers into the Vampire Diaries coven. We'll be discussing all of the shows in the Vampire Diaries universe from the CW network, which included 2 spin-offs, the originals and legacies. The Vampire Diaries premiered in 2009, and it all ended when Legacy series finale aired in 2022. We plan to air our first episode on June 21st, after the convention taking place June 7th through the 9th in Covington, Georgia, where the Vampire Diaries was filmed. The convention, called June Wedding, is being hosted by Epic Events and Entertainment, and I will, of course, be at the wedding of the year. I'll be posting on all of our social media profiles, which you can find in the episode description. If you see me, come say hi, because it's Mystic Falls. Nothing bad ever happens here.
Hi, Bex. I like being Jewish, even if it is hard sometimes. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I'm on the internet places, but I just pop up every now and then, so I'm not doing anything on the internet. Thank you for listening.
And as always, you can find me on Twitter, Tumblr, TikTok, and Blue Sky at Favor Vieira. And you can follow the show on Twitter at IER Podcast. This is usually where I would request that you do everything you can to help us reach the next chapter of our story. But we agreed that due to the subject of this podcast episode, we ought to prioritize something a little bit more important and in keeping with the message that we've been trying to relay to you all. We ask that if you have room in your wallets to please consider donating to the World Food Program USA. It's one of the many programs that's trying to help the people of Gaza. And also consider sponsoring a family through the Olive Branch Foundation. Both myself and this podcast will always stand for the people of Palestine. And I think the best way to end this chapter of our story is to allow Bex to say a few words. We will see you next time for our My Fair Lady episode, as well as a fun little Sherlock Day celebration. Remember, stories gain power in each retelling.
And you are to rejoice before the presence of God. You, your son, your daughter, your servant and your maid, and the stranger and the orphan, and the widow in your midst. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt.